First of all, thank you for the invitation by the organizers. It has been claimed by European administrators in an article published in the European Journal of Migration and Law in 2007 that without managing public perceptions, it is difficult or even impossible to manage migration, especially on the European level. And they furthermore state that perceptions, attitudes, and the support of the public shape the content of legislation and influences the impact of policies. And academics like Galia Lahav have claimed there is indeed an important coherence between public opinion and attitudes of political decision makers with regard to immigration. As a result, one might also expect an impact of public opinion on policy formation in the domain of immigrant integration. And maybe this explains also some positions taken by the European People's Party. In contrast, authors like Gary Freeman have claimed that public opinion only is of minor importance for immigration-related policies. Freeman claims business and technocratic elites, who often tend to be in favor of immigration in light of a globalizing economy, are better organized than the amorphous general public, which tends to be opposed. Elites hence matter much more for policymaking. According to this vision, policy is more likely to be made behind gilded doors, to use the expression of Virginie Giraudon, of meetings at ministerial cabinets and amended in courtrooms, away from the public eye. As a result, policy tends to be more pro-migration and more pro-rights than one would expect when looking at public opinion alone. Now, it is difficult to decide whether authors like Lahav stressing the importance of public opinion for policy making, or like Freeman stressing the importance of targeted mobilization and lobbying for policy making, are closest to the truth when immigrant integration policy is concerned. I tend to find the hypothesis offered by Freeman to be the most plausible one. Leaving aside the issue that one can debate to what extent public opinion really exists as a coherent phenomenon, mass opinion needs to be channeled and articulated by political entrepreneurs to be effective in a competition with special interest groups. Obviously, there is by definition some link between public opinion and policy making in democracies. Politicians and political parties cannot systematically act against public opinion and hope to get re-elected. It is nevertheless also true that immigration policies are often linked to economic interests. Liberal immigration policies are sometimes seen as a necessary evil by policymakers, regardless of what the ordinary citizen may think about immigrants. Furthermore, there is successful pro-immigrant mobilization by civil society organizations, academics trying to bring in the human rights perspective and defending immigrant interests. Authors like Yasmin Soysa have even claimed that a post-national human rights discourse, allegedly on the rise in all liberal democracies, has pushed governments and courts towards expansion of immigrant rights. Last but not least, once policies are in place, citizens can gradually get used to them and eventually perhaps even to support them. Now, the topic of this conference is inclusive democracy. So let me focus on the nexus between policy making and public opinion with regard to immigrant integration in political matters. Now, I do not have the ambition here to settle the debate between authors like Lahav and Freeman, but I want to contribute to the discussions on the topic by pinpointing to the relevance of data sets like the ones constructed by UDO. I've done a bit of exploratory work on this topic myself using the MyPEX data. Now, I have no intention here to claim that it's easy to settle the issue to what extent public opinion pushes towards extension of electoral rights of immigrants, and what intermediate role party configurations play in this. What I hope to be able to do is, however, show the relevance of European-wide data gathering efforts and the usefulness of systematic data collection like the one undertaken by the UDO Observatory to address such a question. Now, one can empirically investigate whether public opinion and policy co-vary across European countries or not, as we did some years ago together with sociologist Barbara Herrmann. In doing so, we did not limit the attention to a single case study or a small-scale comparative analysis, as is so often done. In trying to assess the link between public opinion and policy making, we focus on all EU member states at once as a heuristic strategy. In doing so, we made use of MIPEX, Migrant Integration Policy Index, measuring policy, combined with the Eurobarometer, measuring public opinion. In a similar effort, my colleagues Meuleman and Reeskens have already confronted the MIPEX results with data on social cultural attitudes stemming from the European Social Survey. Meuleman and Reeskens have examined the relation between the integration regime that a country adopts and measures of perceived ethnic threat and attitudes towards immigrants. They made use of a number of scales present in the first round of the European Social Survey, 2002-2003, which had a thematic section on immigration. By means of a latent class analysis, Meuleman and Reeskens constructed a typology of 3 integration policy types. The first class consists out of countries which have scored high compared to other countries on all policy strands measured in MIPEX. Sweden, the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Finland, Portugal, Spain and Italy are part of this group. In the second class, we find countries which, compared to other countries, consistently score badly. All Eastern European countries, Austria, Denmark, Greece and Malta are members of this restrictive group with regard to immigrant rights. The third class of countries shows intermediate results. Typically, they offer limited access to the labor market, to long-term residence and to family reunion, but are a bit more inclusive with regard to nationality acquisition or political participation. Here we find Germany, France, Ireland, Luxembourg, and Switzerland outside of the European Union as members of this group. In opposition to claims by authors like Christian Jopke, Meuleman and Reeskens conclude that there is still quite some diversity with regard to immigrant integration policy in Europe. They equally stress that classic theoretical models, as those of Brubaker, Castles, or Koopmans and colleagues, do not seem to accurately catch the current empirical patterns with regard to immigrant integration policy across Europe, as is documented by MIPEX or in a much more extensive and detailed way by the UDO Observatory as far as citizenship policies are concerned. When relating the 3 classes of integration policies that Meuleman and Reeskens distinguished, relating these to public opinion, it turns out that perceptions that immigration poses serious threats to economic and cultural goods are significantly more widespread among the population in countries with exclusive integration policies. Only Denmark is an exception to this pattern, combining exclusionary policies towards immigrants and the relatively low level of perceived ethnic threat compared to other countries. Meuleman and Reeskens also related the results for the 6 policy strands of MIPEX separately to the attitude scales. They found that resistance against immigration and the perception of economic threat is less prevalent in countries with inclusive labor market policies. They equally found that countries which offer third country nationals access to political participation tend to have lower levels of perception of economic and cultural threat. As an overall conclusion, Meuleman and Reeskens state that open policies apparently not have a backlash as a result. The empirical evidence thus contradicts the group conflict theory, which predicts that inclusive integration policies will increase the level of competition between minority and majority groups, and therefore also the perception of ethnic threat among the latter. Now, an alternative interpretation of the findings of Meuleman and Reeskens might be that in those countries where public opinion is favorable to immigration, policymakers are more easily convinced into setting up inclusive policies for immigrants. And once they are introduced, they tend to remain in place due to the phenomenon of path dependency. Now, let us turn to the issue of access to nationality and expansion of voting rights for immigrants. In debates on enfranchisement of non-nationals, it is often stated that a choice has to be made, either extending electoral rights to non-nationals or facilitating access to citizenship. Now, if we look at a European scale, we can notice that there is no trade-off situation between the two. The data even suggests that openness with regard to electoral rights is linked to openness with regard to access to nationality. And that's a first interesting finding. Now, the following table gives an overview of the percentage of a representative sample of the population in the EU 27, according to the 2003 Eurobarometer data, who support easier access to state citizenship for foreigners. Now, I link these results to the MIPEX score for nationality acquisition in the following figure. On the horizontal axis, we find the proportion of the population favoring easier access to citizenship. And on the vertical axis, we find the score for actual policy with regard to access to citizenship. And one can observe that there is no significant correlation between the two. This shows there's no trade-off, nor an inverse relationship between the policy score on nationality acquisition on the one hand and public support for naturalization on the other hand. The two are unrelated or even very weakly associated. Now, in the next slide, we find results on the horizontal axis for the proportion of the population who is in favor of granting local voting rights, while the vertical axis represents to what extent countries have actually done this. We see there's a strong correlation here. In countries with strong public support, voting rights have been granted. The question here is, was public opinion leading the dance here, or was it following policymaking? Now, there is some evidence that public opinion follows public policy. In the Netherlands, a majority of the population was opposed to voting rights before it was granted, while a majority was in favor after it got granted in the mid-80s. Now, that is, of course, only one case, and one swallow does not make it spring. But let us consider some other results. On this slide, the horizontal axis shows us to what extent political participation, all fields, is facilitated in countries. The vertical axis shows the percentage of the population who agrees with the assessment that the country needs more members of parliament of foreign origin. The correlation is very outspoken and holds after controlling for the percentage of foreigners in the country. The more policy efforts there are to include foreigners in the polity, the more the population thinks they want more diversity in their parliament. And now let us consider the following correlations. The more openness there is on the labor market for foreigners, the more the population thinks there are unequal opportunities for foreigners on the labor market. Now, one interpretation would be that in countries with a poor record, policymakers respond to that situation. But the alternative interpretation is that the more advanced labor market integration policies are, that this increases the awareness of the overall population of the challenges that immigrants face. That would also be the interpretation I would give to the following figure. It shows that in countries with a well-developed anti-discrimination policy, a larger part of the population thinks that ethnic discrimination is widespread. Again, this relationship holds after having controlled for the number of immigrants in all countries, and there's no reason to assume, while there would be a lot more discrimination in one country than in another. Now, one could claim that the level of discrimination boosts policymaking. But it is more plausible, in my opinion, that awareness about discrimination increases in countries with more advanced anti-discrimination policies. Now, it would undoubtedly be too simple to conclude that policymakers should just make inclusive policy and that public opinion will follow. But some of the former slides seem to point in that direction, although I have not proven the causality here. Now, I agree with Meuleman and Weeskens that there is most probably a dialectical relation between integration regimes and immigration-related attitudes. Firstly, policy measures can be seen as institutionalized values with respect to rights and duties of newcomers in society. They thus reflect elite discourse that can influence mass opinion. Secondly, policy measures can lead to more or less inclusion of foreigners in mainstream society, impacting on relations between majority and minority groups and their attitudes. Thirdly, attitudes of the majority population towards immigrants might push policymakers into developing more exclusionary or, in less frequent cases, more inclusive policies. And especially in countries with strong populist anti-immigrant and radical right parties, policymakers will be tempted to opt for stricter policies, even though they actually might think themselves that's a bad idea. In contrast, at times of labor shortage, employers will be in favor of immigration and granting rights to immigrants, and will try and convince both policymakers as the general public of the need of newcomers. Civil society actors, academics, and immigrants themselves will furthermore mobilize and lobby for extension of immigrant rights from a human rights perspective. These forms of elite mobilization are, in our opinion, probably more effective in influencing policy making than vague demands from an amorphous general public unless the latter are taken on board by populist politicians. So I would dare to claim that policymakers are actually leading the dance, not public opinion. The very interesting aspect of a project like UDO is that it allows us to better test such a hypothesis. UDO Observatory not only offers data on citizenship policies, but also provides us with information on the dynamics of public opinion and the dynamics of the political party landscape across Europe. For the first time, we have a European-wide dataset available that can push debates like the one on the nexus between public opinion and policy making in the area of migration and citizenship a step further. So I'd like to sincerely thank all those involved in the observatory for making this possible, and I hope to maybe in the future be able to push the kind of analysis of which I this afternoon just gave you a glimpse a bit further with their and with your help.